Welcome to the Texas Conflict Coach radio program. If you've ever experienced or engaged in destructive or unresolved conflict, then you know it leads to broken relationships, distrust, and damaging results. Our program will help you manage and resolve conflict effectively with strategies, valuable resources, and support. Since 2009, our radio program hosted guest experts from around the globe sharing their perspectives, experiences, and expertise while giving you food for thought. If you can't listen live, then download and listen to any of our 300-plus podcasts in our library at texasconflictcoach.com. So sit back, relax, or join the conversation every Tuesday evening, or tweet us at TXConflictCoach.
Trust is a key element of our personal and professional relationships. Without it, progress grinds to a halt and disagreements become rampant amongst friends, coworkers, and leadership. No matter if you are the newest hire or the CEO, you need to understand what trust is and how it is built, and that distrust is not just the absence of trust, but a separate malignant problem. Hello, I'm Stephen Kotov, your guest host, and joining me today for our program entitled Trust 101, How You Can Build Trust and Overcome Distrust is John Settle. John is a certified mentor mediator, coach, and trainer who is an ACR Advanced Workplace mediator. He is on the faculty of George Washington University Center for Excellence in Public Leadership. He specializes in workplace and organizational applications and speaks widely on trust, negotiation skills, mentoring, conflict management, and ADR subjects. Welcome to the show, John.
Thanks a lot, Stephen.
Well, we're really glad to have you here, and this is a really interesting topic. And what I'm interested in is, John, how did you get on this subject of trust and distrust? What got you interested in it?
Well, it's interesting. So many of the workplace interventions I've done over the years, many mediations and group facilitations and activities and team building, I saw a consistent pattern of some kind of distrust occurring. I also saw how some managers were trusted even though they had made mistakes and took missteps. And so from reading and my own experiences, I began to see that this wasn't really a mystery. There's practical, definable behaviors that build trust and help overcome or avoid distrust.
Well, perfect, because that's what we want you to talk to us about, and that's what we want you to teach us something about. So what is trust, and how does it differ from distrust?
Well, I think the best definition of trust I've ever seen comes out of Professor Robert Hurley at Fordham University. Very simple. He defined trust as confident reliance on someone when you're in a position of vulnerability. And when you think about that in organizations, we see that potential vulnerability in a lot of ways. Employees are vulnerable to their boss for ratings and promotions and keeping their job, and bosses, of course, are vulnerable to employees for getting the job done. And trust becomes critical for individual and organizational success. It takes time to build, but it can be built faster by certain behaviors, as we'll see in a minute. There's a neurological basis for trust. It turns out that trust-building signals, certain behaviors, produce an increase in a peptide called oxytocin. Not OxyContin, I want to make it clear, Stephen, but a peptide, oxytocin, that produces trusting and trustworthy behaviors. Distrust, as you said right at the very beginning, on the other hand, is not merely the absence of trust. It's something that's very different. And again, an academic definition from Professor Roy Lewicki at Ohio State, he defines distrust in this way, and it has 4 parts, so listen for them. The first is negative expectations about someone. That is, you've already made up your mind coming into the room with them that you expect something negative. Signaling fear or dislike of that person, a propensity to attribute sinister intentions to them, and then, of course, a desire to buffer oneself from their conduct, which typically means getting out of their way, trying to avoid them, or trying to have someone intervene on your behalf. And that is a pretty good definition, I think, of distrust, and I think everybody, when you think about it, has experienced that at some time in their life, both trust and distrust.
Well, John, as usual, you just got a lot you said a lot in a little, and so I just want to say a couple of things back to you and make sure that I've got it, especially so that our listeners get it. So the definition of trust that you find is very useful and well put together is a confident reliance on someone when you're vulnerable. Is that correct?
Yes, when you're in a position of vulnerability in relation to that person. And that exists at all levels in organizations when you think about it.
Okay. And then when you're talking about the sort of the four signals that you see from distrust, the first one is that there's this what was it? It was negative.
Negative expectations.
Negative
right.
expectations.
You engage this person, you're already in a position where you almost anticipate, consciously or unconsciously, that this ain't going to go your way. It's that negative expectation. That's of course built on on a lot of different things, your own personal propensity towards people and your experience with them.
Sure. So you have the negative expectations, and then that's followed by, just real briefly, because they're really, really good, and I want to make sure we get them.
And then a propensity to attribute sinister intentions to them. I know that they don't have my best interests in mind. I think that they're out to get me. They don't want me to succeed, that kind of thing. And then, of course, that all leads ultimately to a desire to buffer yourself from that person and from their influence, which, of course, is very dangerous in organizations if that person happens to be your boss or a coworker.
Right, and when you say buffer, it's basically get me away from that person. I don't want to be near them. I don't like them. I don't believe anything they say.
Yes, exactly. Or when it gets down to a point where you're in mediation or something, that buffer can be, I've hired an attorney to deal with you.
Right, exactly. And then, there goes the dollar signs and all the other consequences that follow it. So what are some ways that people and leaders can build trust? So they've either – go ahead.
No, that's all right. I was just that's a great question. And I've identified 27 specific actions and behaviors that build trust, and I'm not going to go through them all, but I do want to try to pick out a number that you can easily recognize, because a lot of this isn't really brain surgery. It's sort of common human interpersonal dynamics in the workplace. And shall I just run down a few of them for you?
Please.
Okay. The first one is a very simple one, but it's so profoundly important, and that's clarity about expectations. You can't hold people accountable without clarity of what you expect of them, and that's not usually an annual performance plan, which some people are surprised to hear me say. Annual performance plans are too general, and they're at best sort of a general guideline, if you will, and of course so many of them are poor that I've seen. I usually like to tell a manager that this really means that each one of your employees, Mr. Manager, should understand, in effect, what's due next Tuesday and what the measure of success is, and that's expectations. Another one I think is an important one is transparency. This is such a key and simple one, too, and so many people violate it. And that's not just what I expect, not just what you need to do, but the why, so that people understand not only what the expectation is, but what's the reason for it. That's a sign of respect. Another one is accessibility, and that has two elements. One, emotional accessibility, Goleman's emotional intelligence. That is your ability to be empathetic, engage people in such a way that they feel you're being responsive to them. And then physically, being around, the old idea of management by walking around, MBWA, which incidentally is being more and more defeated by the use of email and tweets. It's so easy for a manager who's not comfortable dealing with people to sort of close the door and try to operate by email, which is exactly the opposite. Another one is responsiveness. Diane Killian, who's a lecturer in this area, thinks this is one of the most important simple elements, merely being responsive to people, what they've asked for, what they've said. I'll just run down a couple more here. One of the key ones is very basic. In fact, all the others are kind of dependent on it. Practicing good listening and communication skills. And, of course, listening isn't just listening and feedback. It's actively engaging people, being able to show them that you're listening by responding and feeding back and those kinds of things that are part of active listening. Looking to the future and trying to escape the past. You know, what happened last week is something that may not have been the best thing, but let's talk about what happens next week. And we're trying to escape the past and look to the future, responding timely. Here's another one. This one will, I'm surprised how many people run afoul of this. Being honest and telling the truth, especially hard truths. Some people want to be nice and are afraid of having to give tough responses or tough truths, and that's a key thing. People learn to be suspicious of you if you're not telling them the truth, and that's an important one. Consistency, not rigidity, but basing decisions on objective factors and displaying fair, non-arbitrary treatment, which incidentally is the basis behind many, if not most, EEO complaints. Seeking the best outcomes and not merely winning. I've had situations where managers who are coming out of a military setting find sometimes when they're challenged by an employee, find that they're in a position of having to win rather than seek the best outcomes, which is a manager's job. Just two more, and then I'll shut up. I could go on with this forever. One is being able to negotiate, knowing the principles of negotiation. Every manager and supervisor, as part of their training, should take a basic course in just simply how to negotiate. It's a skill, and there's learning involved. And then the final one is reaching to the future again, which is being the first to trust. A good manager, a good employee is willing to take a risk on their employees and being the first to trust. And that goes back to the whole notion of, with my employees, I want to think that they can do the job and empower them to do the job and recognize their ability, and that's a sign of respect. Now, that's just about a dozen things. Each one of those can involve stories and teaching and training, a lot of common sense, and it's just scratching the surface. But those are some good ones to start with.
No, they're outstanding ones, John. You know, I'm looking at them, and I'm going to say them again so that our listeners got them. You know, we've got clarity of expectations, and then from there it's transparency, accessibility, responsiveness, practicing good listening and communication skills.
That's right. All the rest of them are dependent on that. Mm-hmm.
Right. Looking to the future and trying to escape the past, being honest, consistent, being able to negotiate, and being the first to trust.
Mm-hmm. Sure. You left out looking for the best outcomes, not just winning, which is a key thing.
Okay.
Yeah.
So looking for the best outcomes, not just winning. And I can see how you would say that there's a lot of work. Yeah, no, they're all, you know, I can see how they would all mutually support each other and be really necessary for, you know, it's like the ingredients of a good recipe or a good team, right? You would want
yes, it is. But remember that no one's going to do all of those things perfectly. But in combination, the more you do of those things and do them consistently, the more you'll get away when you do make mistakes, because every manager is going to screw up. You cannot manage and do it right all the time. But the manager who has built some level of trust is the manager who, if I can put it this way, gets away with those mistakes. It's the manager who isn't trusted who is immediately has the complaints filed against him, or somebody that goes over his or her head to their boss. So these behaviors collectively are a protective device for a manager, in addition to being just good human relations and as part of the things that increase organizational productivity.
Mm-hmm. So I would like to remind folks that they're listening to the Texas Conflict Coach Blog Talk Radio program with your guest host, Stephen Kotev. Today I'm joined by John Settle, and we are discussing Trust 101, how you can build trust and overcome distrust. And we're very lucky to have John, and he's given us some great advice. And, John, what I want to follow up with is that you talked about distrust being very different from trust. And what are some signs of distrust? You gave us some initial ones. I want to know if there's more to talk about in this realm.
Sure, there is. Well, first of all, it isn't just elements of conflict or complaining. Some of that's natural and even positive, and that's one of the things that managers need to learn is that, conflict is inevitable, and it can even be productive and a positive force if it's managed well. A Navy captain once said to me that a ship that isn't complaining, where there's an unnatural silence, is probably a really sick ship. It's when the conflict and complaints and inefficiencies combine to create a truly pathological environment for people that substantially impacts the productivity of the organization that you find in the background lurking some elements of distrust. Some of the signs are a lot of complaints going outside the organization. That is, remember that idea that I mentioned at the beginning that the people not wanting to engage, seeking a buffer against the person that they distrust. Well, what does that mean? They don't go to the boss and say, "Boss, I'm unhappy about this." Or they may not even go within the organization. What does that mean? They go and file a labor management dispute, or they hire an attorney and file an EEO complaint. There are 100,000 EEO complaints filed annually in the United States, roughly. And the vast majority of them usually do not result in some kind of an outcome that the person sought going in. And that's in large part because they represent something that isn't truly provable discrimination so much as some dissatisfaction that the person hasn't been able to deal with within the organization. Rumors, one of the bad things, usually untrue, scuttlebutt and gossip, and that goes back to lack of transparency and trying to control the information flow rather than be honest with people. And that's a very good sign. The more rumors, and particularly untrue rumors, the more likely there is to be a distrustful organization. Of course, loss of productivity, poor teamwork, absenteeism, all of the poor communication things that you see in an organization, more accompanied by communication primarily through email. The more email communication I see, the more room there is for distrust. Bad email usage and bad meeting management are petri dishes, if you know what I mean. They are places that where the germs of distrust grow. And, of course, good people leave that environment, which leaves the organization in trouble because what's left behind? The people that can't leave. And so all of those things together can be signs of a distrustful environment.
Yeah, I can absolutely see how they would sort of, just as you were talking about what a leader would need to do to build trust. I could see how it would be just like dominoes all falling right on top of each other, or an avalanche where it just builds momentum, and one thing starts to happen, then the other, and then it becomes something that folks possibly feel like they can't ever get out of, or it keeps repeating itself.
That's right, and a manager can't suddenly say, "Oh, I'll change my behaviors to all of the trust things I learned in John Settle's seminar yesterday." Once you've got that distrust, you're down in a hole, and you've got to usually have some more substantive intervention to get out of there. And so, of course, the lesson here is an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. Using those trust signals in the first place to avoid distrust is the very best thing to do. And once you're down there, as we'll talk about in a minute here, you may need a different kind of intervention.
Right. And so, just briefly to go over again for our listeners, the concept that conflict's inevitable, it's just what you do with it. Taking a look at if you see a lot of folks who are having complaints outside of the organization, if they're talking to people other than themselves, that's that idea that you were saying before about there's that buffer, it's like that distance as opposed to dealing with it straight ahead. Rumors, loss of productivity, absenteeism, communication via email, and also with that bad meeting management as things that can do it. What else did I miss? I think you said something else.
Oh,
did I get it all?
When teamwork doesn't work, teamwork depends inherently on trusting relationships between peers and the people who manage them. And when the teams start falling apart, that's usually a sign of distrust as well. The distrust becomes, in effect, a symptom It is both a cause and a symptom of something going wrong.
Mm-hmm. Right. And that's also something that's really, really good to know, because if you're a leader, what are some of the intervention techniques that a leader or somebody on that team could do to overcome distrust?
Yes. Well, this is where you may have to get some outside help, whether through your own HR office or a higher level manager, or maybe even having to bring in a mediator or a facilitator from the outside. To start with, it isn't just to do training or team building or even a couple of mediations. Those can be good things. But if there needs to be, if there's a substantial amount of these kinds of symptoms that we've talked about, first there needs to be a good assessment of what's going on and what happened and how we got there, the source and nature of the problems leading to the distrust, particularized to the setting. What I have learned, and it took me a while to learn it, I learned slow, but I learned well, is that the person calls me up and says, John, I need some team building in my organization. Or John, can you come in? I've got, I might need 2 or 3 mediations over here. Or can you do some training for me? Some of my people don't get along as well as they should, and they need training. Those are usually, to me, sort of red flags that causes me to ask, tell me a little bit more about it. And as I get into it, we start looking for some other things that I'll get to. One that I've seen used a lot, and it can be grossly misused, is employee surveys by management to assess workplace attitudes. Those can be useful, but only if they're credible to the employee population, which usually means follow-up, to be responsive. Again, remember that word I used, responsiveness, responsive to the survey results. The worst thing you can do is go through a couple of employee surveys and think the job is done because, I did go out and ask people what they thought about it, and then the question is, well, what did you do about it? Well, I just told you I did an employee survey, and the real issue is what have you done in response to it? Well, by the time a mediator or a trainer or other consultant is brought in response to some of these issues of distrust, there may already be a crisis. And so we do try to look behind it. And a common intervention is what I call a conflict assessment. And that can be done internally or it can be done with external assistance. And there's a couple of steps in that, which let me tell you about briefly. One that I typically do is interview all employees and supervisors and managers in the organization. That's not a great in-depth thing. It might be a half hour, 45 minutes with each one. And I do that under protection of anonymity, not confidentiality. Now, I'm not going to promise them confidentiality. What I am going to promise them is that I'm going to collapse everything I hear into a series of themes that talk about generalities in this organization, and I'm going to make sure that no one is identified in particular out of this, because I need to feed back to management and the organization what I'm hearing, but I do not intend to endanger anyone. So we collapse the results of the interviews into the principles or themes, and there might be things like management does not appear to be responding to the need for training or cross-training, or people feel there's no future here, or people feel that they're not listened to when there's issues, and so on and so forth, and try to think about putting those together. And then I usually go to management and say, these are some of the things I'm hearing, and recommend some next steps. And a common next step is to have a 1 or 2 day retreat with all employees, reporting on the interviews, and then set them to work in small groups and large group sessions to develop recommendations for actions in response to the themes. Not gripe sessions at this point, because they've already griped in those individual interviews, but designing positive steps for change. And everybody takes responsibility. One question I always ask each employee when they complain is, okay, what can you contribute to making this better? So we make people take responsibility and organize the recommendations into action items and so forth. One of the things that's absolutely critical here, and I will not do this in an organization unless I get this commitment, is that management agrees upfront to listen and respond and to promise to listen and respond to the employees. And then I usually coach managers at the end on how to react and commit to the employees, because that's so often the key missing link, is that managers will go through these kinds of things and retreats and team-building exercises and think they've done the job, when that's just the first step. And the second step is that manager saying, in effect, I hear you, and I'm going to change some things. And here's some things I'm going to do differently. Here's some things we're going to do differently. Here's some things I can't change. And again, that honesty and so on. There are other things that may get involved in that, maybe some individual mediations for some parts of the team where people have gotten at odds. Coaching, of course, for managers. Diane Killian likes to talk about meta coaching for managers, that is, giving them the skills to themselves be coaches for their subordinate supervisors. And you put that together as a package, and it's very likely you can make change and get a fresh start in the organization. And it's a very future-oriented and proactive thing as a way to overcome distrust and get a fresh start in the organization.
Right. And I can't agree with you more on this, John. You know, I found that when I have folks who call me up and they've already got the answer in their back pocket, I immediately start asking more questions. Because to me, I don't think it's that different than if you got a problem with your car. You may think you know the answer, but until you've actually done a real diagnostic on it and taken a look at it, kind of gone underneath the hood, you may be right and you may be wrong. And, you know, folks can spend a lot of money, or in this case, either go further down this distrust, you know, into this land of distrust, and they don't even know it. And then they're frustrated because they think that they got the right thing, but they didn't. And so, you know, going back again for our listeners, you know, employee surveys is fine as long as they tie it back into what you mentioned before about how you can build trust, and that is this transparency component and the responsiveness component. You know, hey, we did this, but what happens with it? And then from there, getting a good assessment, which would be done by, you know, someone like yourself or myself who's a professional in this and has an ability to take a look at it. But, you know, what I'm also hearing you say is that it goes back into this future-oriented component, what's going to happen in the future. And I really think that, you know, folks could just take away, they can take away so much from what you've given us today. But this whole thing of someone complains to you and your response is, well, what can you contribute to change? Is that exactly what it was?
Well, that's certainly part of it. That's not the major part of it, but that is a significant part of it, is that everyone bears some responsibility in organizations for trying to make change happen for the future, for themselves, and for others. And the last thing you want to do is to have everybody saying, none of this is my problem, it's all that boss over there, he's a bad guy. Because all of us are good guys and all of us are bad guys. Coming back to what you said there a moment ago, you think about, well, you know, I could try to fix my car, but I may not know what the problem is. The difficulty here is it isn't just spark plugs and wires. It's human dynamics. And the boss is a human being, too, and they almost can be expected to be defensive and resistant to some of this, because it means taking a look at yourself and saying, I can do this better, which frankly is a key part of leadership, is that search for continuous improvement, not only in your organization but in your own skills. And then, of course, over all of this, coming back around full circle, is to the fact that you can't do it all perfectly. You're a human being as a leader, as a manager, as a supervisor, and that means that you look to the experiencing and practicing these trust-building behaviors in the first place before you get down in that hole.
Well, and as we start to close the show up, you know, if you were to have an assignment for the week, or in a sense I like to just kind of call it homework, if folks wanted to engage with this further, what would you say to them?
Well, there's an awful lot of material out there that you can find online and in books on trust building. So you can just go to your library and look up some of that material. But I think maybe the key thing to do is to simply look the next time when you see something going wrong in your organization to thinking about some of these terms I've talked about. What's the factor that's causing some of this? Is it an element of distrust? Are there some things that manager, supervisor, or your peer that can do better in terms of creating these signals trust and engaging in trusting behavior and focusing on that as one way to resolve this. And so hopefully I would hope that the takeaway here for people is to now look at things a little bit differently in your organization. One of the things all of us that are mediators and conflict people see is this, and I don't mean it to sound dismissive. Every organization thinks they're unique. And so everyone I go into thinks they have a unique problem. But every one of them has a very common set of dynamics because there are human beings in the organization. And these generalities about trust building and how you overcome distrust are available to all of us if you think about them.
Mm-hmm. No,
There's one book I will recommend just quickly.
Sure.
It's a good one. It's called The Speed of Trust by Stephen M.R. Covey. It's called The Speed of Trust, the one thing that changes everything. You can easily pick that up off of Amazon, and he'll give you more of an exposition in all of these things I've talked about. But mostly it's common sense.
Sure. Well, sure sounds like it. And, how can folks reach you if they wanted to talk to you further about this and learn more about it?
Sure. Just get me at my email, my real name is Norval. You've been calling me John, which I prefer, but my mother named me Norval. So my email address is nsettle@comcast.net. And feel free to write me and ask me a question, and I'll be glad to respond. I have an organization called Settlement Associates, and there is a website, settlementassociates.org.
And that's just like if someone's going to settle something or figure it out. It's SETTLE.
You got
so it's straight ahead. So, John, thank you very much for a wonderful show. Any closing comments?
No closing comments other than extend your trust, folks, and try to use some of these techniques.
Well, thank you again, John. It's been a wonderful show.
Thank you for listening to the Texas Conflict Coach. We hope you've enjoyed the program. You can find over 300 podcasts archived to listen at your own convenience at texasconflictcoach.com or download the podcast at iTunes or Stitcher Radio. To learn about upcoming radio programs and resources, sign up for our monthly e-newsletter.